Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this new ForoCompetencia breakfast. We have the honor today of having Margarida Matos Rosa, who is the Autoridade de Concorrência, the president of the Autoridade de Concorrência de Portugal, and also currently vice chair of the ICN. That's correct. And she gladly accepted to talk to us about the current trends and antitrust enforcement. So without further ado, Margarida, all yours.
Thank you very much. And buenos días a todos y muchas gracias por haberme invitado. I think I'm going to keep it to 2 sentences because otherwise it starts declining. The quality starts declining. So it is, I should say that it is really my pleasure to be here today and to join this forum. And I wish to thank for that Julian, of course, and Eduardo Perez Mata for the kind invitation. We decided to address recent trends in antitrust enforcement, and I chose 3. One of them being crisis cartels, the other one being inflation, of course. How could we avoid that topic? And the other one, no poach agreements. So bear with me for a while, and then Julian, I think we will open for questions, right?
That's right.
Okay. So let me start to say that in the current context, countries, of course, around the world are facing extreme changes in the economy. We've spoken about strong inflation rates, but we should also consider global supply chain disruptions, as well as a strong increase in public spending in the context still of recovery strategies. And it is true that firms have been adjusting their business models to the new digital and green standards, not to mention the long-lasting changes in consumer behavior. And all of this was triggered to start with by lockdowns, if not triggered, at least accelerated by lockdowns and the pandemic. But it only ensued after that. It only continued after that. Not only firms, but workers as well seem to be adjusting. And in doing so, they are looking apparently for more inspiring professional avenues. And all of this means that we are at present in a context of high risk for collusive behavior. And I will go into a little bit of the details of what I just said. I believe that given the characteristics of the current situation, there is potential for detecting cartels in areas, first of all, of public procurement, because quick and large amounts of financial support by countries are being spent, and that may give rise to bid rigging. Second, sectors that could benefit from the pandemic's exceptional circumstances, for example, health services. 3, e-commerce and the digital space, because a lot of business has shifted to that area during lockdowns and it stayed there. And then 4, in no poach and other wage fixing agreements. Why? Because of the shortage of workers in so many areas, in so many fields. I'm sure you all feel that as well. This means that enforcers and practitioners alike must keep high vigilance for so-called crisis cartels. And at the Autoridade de Concorrência, or Portuguese Competition Authority, we are seeing evidence of potential cartels which arose precisely during the pandemic crisis. Whether this will be a global wave of enforcement associated with crisis cartels at this stage, it's early to say. But crisis cartels, as you know, are those in which firms affected by a crisis agree to reduce overcapacity and agree to maintain or even increase prices. And then taking a wider approach to this concept of crisis cartels, there may also be some of them which are formed between firms that wish to maximize gains from the crisis by colluding to increase prices of goods and services. And this can be labeled as opportunistic behavior, but also one that is illegal. And by the way, the current steep increase in inflation also increases the risk of seeing such cartels. So all of this occurs when many households and firms are in a financially vulnerable situation. And this is why it is important for consumers that antitrust agencies maintain high vigilance towards anti-competitive behavior in this period. We do our best, we must do our best so that efforts of taxpayers, of consumers, of workers, of households, of firms and entrepreneurs are not misappropriated by members of a cartel. And how do we do this? I think we must be at the very minimum up to speed with enforcement. Enforcement in all dimensions of cartel enforcement, for example, prevention, detection, investigation, and deterrent sanctioning. And we should never forget that combating cartels is at the heart of antitrust enforcement. And this is why, to cite again my own example at the Portuguese Competition Authority, we have kept anti-cartel enforcement as our top priority. And in doing so, in the past 5 years, we have sanctioned dozens of companies and associations for a total of about 1.4 billion in fines. And 90% of these were applied to illegal horizontal behavior, so in line with our priorities. We have kept our focus on sectors also close to consumer needs and on sectors that have a horizontal impact on the economy. For example, food retail, labor markets, telecommunications, banking and insurance, public procurement related, for example, to education services, surveillance, health, infrastructure, just to name a few. And I should say here that this is also aligned with another priority of the Portuguese Competition Authority the last few years, which has been combating bid rigging in public procurement. So in this area, like several other agencies, we launched a countrywide outreach initiative that raised awareness, and that has resulted in an increase in the quantity and the quality of the tips received, and has allowed to build a pipeline for enforcement action that led at the end of the process to fines being imposed on several of these cartels. On the other hand, we should not forget that in periods of crisis, we may see exceptions arise, for example, in terms of collaboration between competitors. And so one of the challenges during these times is to ensure compliance with competition rules while taking into consideration exceptional circumstances. At the EDC, this is a topic that we have embraced earlier on. A few examples, for example, from March 2020, in tandem with the European Competition Network's joint statement on the application of competition law during COVID-19, we issued a policy statement that indicated that in the period of great collective efforts, we would remain vigilant in the detection of anti-competitive behavior that exploited the situation to the detriment of the people and the economy. Why? Because such anti-competitive behavior would tend to worsen the economic consequences of the pandemic. But also in that policy statement, we acknowledged that the context could trigger the need for temporary business cooperation in order to prevent scarcity, for example, in the supply of essential goods, or to address other market failures. And as a result, the agency made itself available to provide individual guidance to companies by issuing written guidance, for example, to the banking and financial sector, but also to the pharmaceutical sector. Why did I bring this discussion if the topic of today is current trends? Well, because 2 years later, the possible need for temporary business cooperation is still a reality, and particularly as the war in Ukraine evolves. It has evolved, it has been going on for quite a few months now, and this causes the disruption in several markets. Enforcers may feel the need to act in this respect. The impact has been felt very strongly, at least in energy and wheat prices at a global level. In general, inflation is on the upward trend, though it is unclear how it will evolve. Whether these are lasting effects for the global economy, we still don't know. In any event, in this regard, again, at the European Union level, the ECN, as I said, the network of competition authorities at the European Union, of which we are part, issued again a joint statement 2 years later in March 2022 on the application of competition law in the context of the war in Ukraine. So similar to the statement 2 years before that, the ECN emphasized its understanding that the current circumstances may trigger the need for companies to address severe disruptions caused by the impact of the war. And this may include, for example, temporary cooperation in order to ensure the purchase, the supply, the fair distribution of scarce products or goods. It may also include temporary cooperation in order to mitigate severe economic consequences, including those which arise from compliance with sanctions imposed by the EU. In any event, in the current circumstances, the ECN mentioned in its joint statement that it will not actively intervene against strictly necessary and temporary measures specifically targeted at avoiding the mentioned severe disruptions. Why is it important to say this? It is important to say this along with the fact that these are measures that should be temporary and proportionate to the extreme circumstance faced, as you would guess. Now, we have all seen how price caps can be focal points that hinder price decreases. A recent example being in several countries, the price of COVID self-tests. And on the other hand, while we recognize the importance of guidance, European enforcers made it clear that they would not allow companies to take advantage of the pandemic and cartelize or abuse their market power. And this was clear in the statements I just mentioned, and also in the enforcement actions which followed that. There was also a similar statement that I will not go through by the ICN, but just to mention it here, it also showed availability to provide informal guidance to companies under special circumstances. These policy statements, I think, were important to let the market know, on the one hand, that antitrust enforcers remained fully operational, open for business, that during this time, and still to our time today, it is essential to maintain a very strong advocacy and enforcement activity. And we know from previous crises that under-enforcement is certainly counterproductive. Overall, it is important to ensure worldwide that essential products, for example, in energy or food, remain available. So that's the other side to maintaining strong enforcement. We should also make sure that essential products come through to consumers and to firms, and that the current crisis is not used to undermine a competitive level playing field between companies through anti-competitive agreements or exploitation in terms of excessive pricing on affected products. We have indeed continued to enforce competition as vigorously as possible, but we now face a different challenge. We face inflationary pressures, and this is where I turn to the issue of inflation and anti-cartel enforcement. So, just to give you an idea, in countries that are part of the Eurozone, annual inflation was 9.1 in this past August. Just roughly a year ago, in July 2021, inflation was only 1.1%. And we know that the main factors of this inflationary trends are, first and foremost, the surge in energy prices, as well as the prices of food and other products since at least the fall of 2021. The second factor is the reopening of the economy following lockdowns, but also the government stimulus that has been put forward. The tensions in the global supply chains caused by the war in Ukraine is another factor. And we also know that market power is about price levels, not short run or rapid price increases. And that while the concern with concentration in markups has certainly been there for quite some time, it's every agency's concern at all times not to let market power build too much over time. Inflation is a much more recent issue, and I think we should not mix both, although we should keep, of course, our vigilance on both in how they interact. Further, also theoretically, and if there are a few economists in the room, I know there are a few, theoretically at least, there is no reason to expect the pass-through of cost increases to be higher in concentrated industries than in competitive ones. But all that being said, it is also true that both lack of competition and inflation lead to higher prices, and that the more competitive economy does influence the inflation dynamics in the longer term. And that is done via a downward pressure on profit margins and on costs, including through incentives to invest in process innovation. There are also several empirical studies that show that more competitive markets reduce the vulnerability of the price level to swings in capacity pressures and unanticipated shocks. And they also show that firms in industries with higher search and switching costs are more likely to benefit from inflation in the form of larger markups. So even though lack of competition is not the main driver of the current inflationary trend, I mentioned three of the main factors, that doesn't mean that there cannot be potential second order effects of competition in the inflationary trends. And that remains largely an empirical question that we all want to tackle at competition agencies. Now, on the other hand, while competition policy's main goal is not to address soaring inflation in the short term, and we all know that, of course, that's for central banks to do, it does not mean that competition policy does not have a relevant role to play. And in fact, there are many things we can do, at least we like to believe that. Competition policy can reduce prices and contribute to restrain inflation. And I might be stating the obvious when I say that anti-cartel enforcement contributes to controlling price levels. While it does not solve inflationary pressures, as I said, it is key to deter conduct that could otherwise make inflation much worse. And to that respect, competition agencies are aware that in the current context, temporary supply chain disruptions may be used to disguise a cartel. This is something that I have heard to be called inflation washing. Competition agencies worldwide are very vigilant in this respect. We now seem to have stronger grounds to argue in favor of reforms to reduce barriers to entry. And this is because we are now facing a double challenge of recovering the economy and dealing with an inflationary trend. So the opportunity seems to be there to argue more strongly in favor of reforms that reduce such barriers. And this is why, to give our own example here at the ADC, in April last year, we sent a report to government with a set of principles to be considered in the design of what we call the Resilience and Recovery Plan, and which is a plan to jumpstart the economy after the pandemic. And among other things, the ADC highlighted that this was an opportunity to implement several recommendations that we had issued across sectors in the past several years. These recommendations span from access to self-regulated professions to fintech and banking, to roads, rail, maritime and port sectors, to telecoms, to energy, to electricity, electric mobility, and so there's a lot to be done, and this seems to be a good moment to do that. Another point I'd like to bring to this discussion is price controls. And here we also issued recommendations and a paper that we sent to policymakers in order for them to have an informed point of view from when they're taking decisions on prices, and when they are looking at how to tackle strong inflation. And I would say that here, for example, in price controls, governments are certainly more likely to introduce such controls when inflation rises. For example, we've seen several in gas or electricity across Europe. I'm sure in many countries this has been the case. However, price controls have been pointed as not having a significant impact on inflation. There are several studies that point to that, but on the other hand, they impose risks to competition. For example, if the cap on prices is set too high, it may act, as you will guess, as a focal point for collusion. And if the cap is set at an artificially low level, which does not allow firms to recoup their costs, that may encourage the exit of firms, and that may lead to shortages, which would in turn reinforce some of the factors that have triggered inflation in the first place. And here, competition agencies can play, as I said, an advocacy role in informing policymakers of such risks and encouraging them to find alternative solutions if they can do so. So in a nutshell, how can competition policy contribute to protect purchasing power? In a 360 degrees view on purchasing power, I would highlight three ways in which the current macroeconomic conditions can put a strain on citizens. It can put a strain on citizens as taxpayers, as consumers, as workers, and agencies can promote welfare on taxpayers by promoting competition and efficiency in public procurement, again, in order to avoid waste of public money. This means advocating for an efficient design of public tenders, tenders which are participated, which are open to many participants, and which are able to deliver value for money. And of course, alongside this, the agency should also be able to combat bid rigging in public procurement more efficiently. As consumers, this approach means introducing competitive discipline for firms to compete more fiercely with one another. And as workers, that means inclusive economic growth and not being deprived from the opportunities that an open and competitive market can bring for them. So that liaises very well with recommendations for opening up professions. Now, this, as I said, has been a priority for the Portuguese Competition Authority for a while now. We advocated very strongly for reducing barriers for accessing liberal professions, but also combating anti-competitive agreements in labor markets, such as no-poach or wage fixing agreements. And I will address this further as I come to the end. It certainly does not sound fair to anyone if firms agree not to poach, not to hire, or fix the wages of their employees. For example, with an aim to ensure that inflation is not reflected in wages and the difference can be appropriated in the form of higher margins. This not only hurts workers, it also distorts allocative efficiency and price signals. And in these three axes, our dimension as consumers, taxpayers, workers, competition policy can play an important role in promoting growth and welfare. Now, let me turn to the last point, which is no-poach agreements. And Julian, if I'm still okay with time, I will deal with this.
Sure, of course.
Yeah. All right. Why are labor markets important during these times? I think we can all agree that open and flexible labor markets allow for new opportunities. They support a resilient, and innovative and inclusive economy. And this is what we all need after the 2021 economic shock. But we also see that there are significant shortages in many professions, if not close to all. And so we should take a careful look at this from a competition policy and a competition enforcement point of view. So topics such as barriers to professional mobility, no-poach agreements, as I said, are just a couple of examples where the interplay between competition and labor markets arise. Again, in 2021, the Portuguese Competition Authority issued a report and best practices guide on anti-competitive agreements in the labor market. This was initially aimed at raising awareness of companies and human resources professionals, but also employees and recruitment agencies on the negative effects of no-poach and wage fixing agreements. In this report, for example, we emphasized that agreements between firms regarding no-poach and wage fixing may have negative effects on markets. And this is, for example, through the decrease in mobility, through the decrease in innovation, through a negative impact on downstream markets, to say just a few. These agreements limit, as I mentioned, the individual freedom of firms to define their strategic commercial conditions, for example, in hiring and on setting wages and benefits conditions. And they also may be responsible for negative effects on workers and consumers. Now, we try to have employers adopt an independent and competitive behavior in labor markets. And in this advocacy efforts, we launched a series of outreach sessions which are aimed at promoting competition in labor markets by building communication channels and by incentivizing the report of strong indicia of illegal behavior in the competition field to us. I have to say that these sessions are based on very clear messages on what no-poach and wage fixing agreements are. They contribute to raising awareness. For many people, they contribute to bringing labor markets into the competition arena, while it has more traditionally been thought of as not being close to our field. And this has raised many red flags, actually, to the existence of these agreements. So we've also been active through our enforcement activity in labor markets. To give you an example, and I'm coming to the end in 2 minutes. The first decision was issued by the Portuguese Competition Authority just a few months ago regarding an agreement involving the Portuguese Professional Football League and 31 sports companies, and a fine of roughly 11 million euros was imposed. The agency is now, as I said, investigating other no-poach agreements as a result of our outreach initiative, and these ongoing investigations show that, of course, no-poach agreements, as we must probably all know, exist well beyond sports markets. And this is where I stop, and I turn to you, Julian, and everyone who wishes to ask questions.
Thank you very much, Margarida. Very complete and interesting to see how strong the Latin American influence in the development of antitrust has played a role. Those issues mentioned by you are issues that historically have been problems that we have dealt in Latin America, but now they have become more international. We have Esteban Greco.
Thank you, Julian, and thank you, Margarida. Excellent presentation, and it's a pleasure to see you again. I hope I have to see you in person, maybe soon. And you touch different interesting issues. I will only ask a kind of question about inflation, because this is a hot topic in Argentina for years. And we have a kind of a PhD in inflation and competition interaction. So my question is, I read the report or recommendation that the ADC made. I think is very insightful about this purchasing power and inflation and competition. Can I ask you if, because my understanding of your presentation and this report is like the advocacy way to say, you said it very elegantly, but it's like, please governments, do not use competition policy to fight inflation. Do not make price controls, do not sit the competitors in a table to agree about prices. Let competition authorities do their job, because this will be good for a healthy economy and will in the medium or long term contribute to a stronger recovery and stronger economy. But at the end of the day, we can say, well, inflation is a macroeconomic problem and competition policy is a microeconomic issue or tool. Even it is microeconomic, but not small, because it is across all the economy. But I think, and my question is from maybe a developing country perspective and Latin American perspective and Argentinian perspective, that when we have weak institutional arrangements, mixed inflation and competition policy could lead to some kind of distortion of competition policy to use it as a tool, because it's a really important temptation for maybe policymakers that has to deal with inflation to use kind of this tool to try to fix these price increases in the short term, and maybe the solution is not good. Even I think I was reading, and maybe some top politicians in the developed world made statements about some kind of, I think, erroneous theories of harm about how lack of competition or concentration is a cause of inflation. So what do you think, if you could say this in a politically correct way, maybe about this temptation and this interaction with the public policy temptation to use competition policy to fix prices in the short term?
Thank you, Esteban, and I really look forward to seeing you again very soon in person as well. You're right. It's a difficult message to put through to, I would say, decision makers, policy makers. Of course, it's governments, but it can also be the parliament. It can be regulators, sector regulators as well. And so our message goes to all of them. And we try to put ourselves in their own shoes, right? They are facing a lot of pressure as well from citizens, from firms, from the whole economy, and they need to take action. So what our position, at least from my point of view, is to contribute to an informed decision. Contribute as much as possible and as much as vocal as possible to an informed decision, one that is the least disruptive as possible for competition policy. And I don't know if I'm being too politically correct, but I think that it really is what we aim for. We don't, of course, we don't think we are in the same role right now for inflation as the central banks, for example. Of course, they have a stronger power to deal with short-term inflation spikes, but we can and we should inform governments of alternatives to price controls, and we should let them know that if price controls have their risks, of course, in the end, governments and policymakers may also and still decide to go for price controls if they think it's the best option. But we should at least inform them that if they do go through that option, they should have they should impose caps or controls temporarily, and temporarily means short term. I'm talking about 3 months, and they could be renewed or not. But if you don't put at least a time frame to the policy, then it risks staying on and on forever. In people's minds, it becomes effective forever, and it will be much more difficult to take down the price cap or price control later on. But there are more risks. There are risks, as I mentioned, of fixing a price cap or a price control too high, and then it becomes a focal point for companies. And I don't see a lot of consumer benefit there. It can also be set too low, and then it can drive companies away and out of the market, and then that only reinforces the inflationary pressure that we see. And so we should alert governments and policymakers in general for those risks. So if they choose not to take other types of measures, for example, through taxation, which is less distortive, or through the protection of lower income households, for example, which is in our view is less distortive, if they still feel the need to impose price controls, then make them temporary, make them as much as possible non-distortive, and keep looking for other alternatives. And we there's a limit to what we can do. We're not deciding. We're not in the policymakers' shoes, if I can say so, but we have a duty to inform. I hope that helps.
Diego?
Yes, hello, thanks, Julian. Hello, everybody. Well, my question was answered by Margarida, but I want to say, just had said Julian, that the issues he brings today to the discussion were well known by us in Argentina and all Latin American, and now we are not alone. I don't know if it's good or not, but it's good to know that we are not alone. Well, as she said, all these issues, I think, exceeds the agency's power or activities, but still, I think that all we agree that it's better to have commercial wars rather than military wars. So I think, as she said, that the agencies should always not only inform, but also recommend governments in all kinds of actions, knowing that we are not making decisions. If we think about OPEP, I think it was the biggest cartel in the world for years, and no agency ever think about make a file on this issue. But all the problems in energy that are involved in government decisions, I think that the antitrust environment should recommend all kinds of actions that may reduce the conflicts.
Thank you, Diego. And can I say that, of course, we all have OPEC in mind, but it may be a jurisdictional issue because we don't have any agency with powers, jurisdictional powers over all of those countries. So there's only so much that we can do as a single agency with a country within our jurisdiction. Can I just say a few words about something that was said earlier, also about concentration and what we can do. I think I'm sorry, I go back to an issue raised by Esteban also on what we can do to combat concentration. I think although concentration doesn't seem to be the cause of this current inflation spike, we still need to be very vigilant on the buildup of concentration over time in all sectors. So if there is a merit to bringing concentration to this debate, although we must be wary of mixing it with inflation right now, I think there is merit to bring it to the debate, because we as competition enforcers need to be vigilant about the buildup of concentration over time. That's why we have merger control. And that's a topic that should always be on top of our concerns, because it is not rare to see sectors in which we have 2-3 companies, and that might bring up serious issues of market power that do not benefit consumers. So I think it's actually a good thing that we are having such a debate on market power, market concentration, especially in the US, not so much in Europe, because it just reminds us of why we're here and why merger control is important. Sometimes it's I feel that it has become almost a day-to-day, regular day-to-day activity of the authority without thinking why it has been implemented in the first place. It is to combat the buildup of market concentration. And then going back to Diego's comment on inflation, it is true that we seem to have joined many other countries in terms of what the current rate is right now. But we also seem to live in an artificially low interest rate scenario for the past few years. So that's also, that didn't seem very real also in the past. So although it's very high now for European standards and it should come down, it was also probably very low also in the past few years. Should I take on more questions?
Sure, Eduardo.
Thank you, and thank you, Juliana. Thank you, Margarida, for accepting this invitation to participate in this event today and share with you all your reflections on this international situation that we are living. I would like to ask you two questions related with the ICN and with the role of the ICN in these circumstances. Well, first of all, there is somewhat well related with what Esteban was saying. I think it's clear that the sources of inflation that we are living now have to do with the energy crisis generated by the war with Russia and Ukraine, the commodity scarcity, the supplies shock generated partially by the pandemic, and also the international, the imbalances, the fiscal imbalances that have been generated in many countries, also by the pandemic. But not any of these reasons have to do with necessarily with lack of competition, and normally the solution is regulating markets. The recent case, Margarida, in especially Europe, in the case of regulation of energy companies that was announced by the European Commission in the last few days, I didn't see any, at least any public positioning by the competition agencies on this decision. So my question my first question has to do what should be the role of the ICN, and being you being as a vice chair of the ICN today. What should be the role of the ICN in this advocacy strategy that you are suggesting? And second, this is also a situation that we are living in many regions. The shift from the political point of view of governments that, just to put it in some mildly, that do not trust in market-oriented policy, and obviously do not trust in competition as a part of the instrument, as an important instrument to promote efficiency in our economies. In the case of Latin America, for instance, we have 82% of our population today governed by most of the governments are from the left, do not trust the market-oriented policies, and even some populist governments that are not necessarily from the left also have a nationalistic position and do not have any interest in promoting market-oriented policies. So what do you think should be the role of the ICN also in this international situation? Do you think, well, I mean, those are my two questions. So I thank you very much again.
You're on mute, Maria.
Yeah, sorry, I was trying to unblock the screen, but it worked. Okay, so Eduardo, I think your remarks are very pertinent. They make a lot of sense. I'm sorry if there's some noise in the background from a plane that is just passing. Well, there has been evidence in the very recent past, and I mentioned as we were speaking about the ICN coming forward, for example, during the pandemic, and with clear statements alongside those that the European Competition Network also issued. And so it showed how competition agencies are ready to take a stance and state their views on what should be the right approach to a crisis. Regarding what you mentioned in the current period in time and the all these questions of whether or not we should have price controls, whether or not we should have regulated markets. Well, I would say that the ICN is very much aware of this, and it's very much not just aware, but it's promoting also a workshop on October 25th. So very soon, in about a month, in which it will cover issues related to the economic recovery, but also inflation. And within this panel of inflation, it will address also this debate that you think that you just mentioned as very important. And I could not agree more. I mean, we at the Portuguese Competition Authority, and I'm sure other agencies have also put through advice to governments as to the risks of going back to regulated markets, as to how negative this can be in the long run. And we must, in my view, we must contribute to have an informed decision by policymakers by stating what we believe in and what our principles are in the competition policy arena. So stay tuned. This is what I want to say. Stay tuned, and I think the workshop will be an opportunity to hear from the ICN on this topic, important topic that you raised, Eduardo, on regulated or unregulated markets. Thank you.
Okay, Ivo.
Hi, Margarida. Thank you very much for your so interesting presentation. When I hear to you, my first thing is that the Portuguese authority have done everything. So my question is, what are you planning to do this year and next year? Which are your new goals in the authority?
Ivo, thank you very much, and good to see you again. You put me in a difficult spot because I typically write down the priorities for the authority in the last quarter. We're still not there. We're a few days away, but yes, indeed, we are looking into that already. I mean, one important thing to say is that inflation is not yet gone, at least from the Portuguese economy's perspective, and so we will probably have to continue to deal with that and with the pressure on either the competition authority or policymakers in dealing with inflation. And we touched upon some of the typical behavior from a policymaking point of view that we want to inform as much as possible and with alternatives if possible. Now, I think one of the big topics for us will be crisis cartels in a large perspective. So when I say crisis, it's not just when you have a downturn, economic downturn, and you have cartels trying to maintain their gains, or at least try to avoid the losses in relative losses as much as possible in an economic downturn situation. For me, crisis cartels may also very well happen when you have situations like the one now, in which you have an excuse, which is inflation, to raise prices and to raise them in a coordinated manner. So we're going to be very, I'm probably stating priorities ahead of time, but that's something that is already on our risk lists and on our priority list, to be very vigilant for those kinds of situations in which companies in a coordinated manner may take advantage of the current situation to raise prices. Crisis cartels, I think, are for us one of the big priorities. But this would not be new, because in the past few years we've been having cartels as our top priority. It's just that now we see enhanced risks, as I mentioned, to have crisis cartels emerge. Not to mention also that the fact that we saw on the consumer side a displacement of their purchases from bricks and mortars to e-commerce, and we need to be up to date in our tools in order to uncover coordinated behavior there. Not to mention abuse, of course, but collusion as well in this type of environment. So we continue to build up our tools there and to develop our tools there. We're very much we keep being very much in line with what is the possible development of collusive tools in the digital space, namely through algorithms, namely through the use of a third party. And that's something that is here to stay. We just need to keep up. We just need to keep up and keep building our tools in order to be effective in detecting collusive behavior there.
Great.
But there's always a lot to do. So sometimes we have our priorities, and then we have just the typical cartel showing up, and that we want to tackle as well. But yeah, but so I would say cartels again, especially crisis cartels, including those in an inflation period, and collusive behavior in collusive or abusive behavior in digital markets.
Margarida, do you have time for one more question?
Of course, my pleasure.
Pepe.
Okay, thank you, Margarida. It was a great presentation. I just wanted to raise a couple of points. Of course, we all know that competition policies work much better within a wider constellation of public policies. And it is difficult to make a case for competition policies without taking into account the importance of having sound macroeconomic policies to cope, to face inflation, for instance, monetary policies, fiscal policies, and also some sectors, like health and education. When you introduce competition in these sectors, price competition in these sectors, the results could be awful. We have experienced that in Peru. They have led to lower quality education, and in health, for instance, when you have private sector, a private health sector using the public, to extract some rents, like physicians getting paid in the public and working for the private at the same time, some conflicts of interest. So what I'm saying is that we need a coherent, consistent system of public policies, and competition policies are a key component of that. But we do need a holistic approach, which is critical. Training professionals in this area of antitrust implies having this broader perspective, because competition is not an end in itself, but a means to achieve higher ends, meaning quality of life and all that. And I'm saying this because you made a point about labor markets. Of course, labor markets are very different in our countries. We have a huge, what is called an informal sector. I don't like this dualistic perspective about formal, informal as being two separate spheres. In fact, formal firms hire workers in an informal way. They don't pay them their social benefits, but they are formal. So anyhow, what I'm saying is that unions, for instance, have an important role to play. So labor regulations to protect workers are critical, because if you have stronger unions, you have more aware consumers and more competitive markets, which imply more inclusive societies. So I am, very cautious about applying mechanically these competition rules for labor markets, because they are higher issues, more important issues at stake. And finally, on the financial sector, a friend was telling me, I'm now in the US as a visiting researcher, and a friend was telling me that he went to the bank because he had this old idea that he's got his deposits in the bank, his money in the bank, and the bank uses those deposits for loans. And the bank representative told him, we don't need your money. We don't need your money anymore. So banks don't need the money of the people. They have become so huge, so strong, so powerful that they no longer need deposits from the public. I'm saying this because with this inflation, central banks are increasing their interest rate, and there is a pass-through from the interest rates, the target rates that the central banks fix, and of course the interest rates that the banks charge to their customers. And of course, this is in the hands of our regulatory authorities. What about the role of the competition authorities in Europe with this huge financial sector, which is of course a world system? Well, that's basically the points I wanted to raise. I hope you have something. I'm sure that you have something to say about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And can I say regarding the rate on deposits, you're right. I mean, it's been very cheap to borrow money. Banks have been borrowing money very cheaply, which means that they don't. That's going to change, right? But you're right. They didn't, because they were borrowing at a very cheap rate. They didn't pay much on deposits. But that's starting to change, because it's basic interest rates are going up. And yesterday there was another hike again, both in the US and in Europe. We'll see how much they will continue to rise. But at a certain point, there will be a change in the behavior between banks and their clients. So I think what you're describing is absolutely true, but is bound to change with the current change in basic interest rates. That's one point. I also want to say that there are many agencies, and ours in Portugal is certainly one of them, that has paid a lot of attention to financial markets, and especially banking, and especially the payment systems. And we've both been very active in recommending sector regulators and the government and parliament in order to open up competition in several fronts. I mentioned payment systems, but I also want to say, for example, in very topics which seem not to be new anymore to many of us, but still there are barriers to competition there. For example, when you buy insurance or you have a loan, you're obliged to, in some countries, you're obliged to have an account with a certain bank, and this doesn't need to be the case. So we advocate in things which are more structural, like opening up the payment system, opening up the sector as a whole to more innovative models, business models, but we also act on very simple things that remain closed, like the ones I mentioned, remain closed to competition. And it's a constant struggle, I would say. We need to keep our vigilance over the laws that keep being enacted in different sectors, including the financial sector. And that's a sector which is not an easy one from the point of view of cumulated legislation that exists in that sector. So it may be dense for a competition lawyer to tackle, or a competition expert, legal expert at an agency to tackle, but we need to be vigilant and we need to keep up our efforts there. Now, regarding no poach, I think we don't disagree. I think we don't disagree. I think we emphasize in our reports, especially the reports, because the best practices guidebook is issued to firms, but on the report we have a very in-depth analysis of the effects of no poach agreements for firms, for consumers, for workers, and especially between workers and consumers, they seem to be very negative. And for workers, so they are aligned. I mean, the interest in having more competition in labor markets seems to be aligned from the point of view of consumers and workers. By the way, for this report, we had an open consultation, a public consultation that was that received input from labor unions as well, and they were very let's say supportive of this work we did. So they didn't raise concerns, as far as I can remember, they didn't raise concerns about the messages we had, which were messages related to competition, of course, but they didn't see, as far as I can remember, any drawbacks with that. Why? Because these agreements, as I mentioned, have negative effects on markets. I mentioned the decrease in mobility, the decrease on innovation, the negative impact of the whole market, especially downstream, but they also limit the individual freedom of the individual. And they also limit the opportunities for the individual to move to another company and simply be happier or earn more. And that seems ethically wrong. Although we at the agency, and I say this again, our mandate is only to be concerned with competition policy, but it has other effects which are also positive for the worker and for the individual. I hope I helped there, but in any case, I'm very glad if you want to share my notes with all of you through ForoCompetencia, and if there are questions afterwards, we're very happy to engage with you and develop further on these topics.
Thank you, Margarida.
Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks, Margarida. Now it's time for your concluding remarks.
Julian, I think I've said more or less what I wanted to say. I'm very happy that I had all this time to dwell on these three topics, which are very close to my heart. Crisis cartels, and certainly cartels. I have cartels written on my forehead for sure by now, 6 years after I started here. I think it's a topic that never goes away, but I think in the current context that comes, the current context of inflation, which comes also from a 2-year period of pandemic, I think it's more than ever a topic to be very vigilant on from a competition point of view. Then inflation is certainly a topic from which we competition agencies should not shy away. We should be vocal with our contribution, and we mentioned here some points in which we can bring added value to policymakers. At least I see it as added value. But I think there's more to be said on that from competition agencies' point of view. And then on no-poach and other types of agreements, illegal agreements in labor markets, I think first of all, it's a topic that we wanted to be more active on. We should all, in my point of view, should be more active on in terms of illegal behavior from a competition point of view, but even more so in a context in which we see shortages of labor in so many sectors, and workers seem to be very disenchanted with the labor market, and we need our contribution to make the labor market a happy place is certainly one that should not overlook. So thank you very much for the opportunity to discuss these three topics with you, and I look forward to continuing this discussion in other fora.
Great, thank you very much. On behalf of everyone, thank you for your time and your generosity, and we look forward to seeing you in future events as well. And then the next breakfast will be on October 14th. The OECD, through Paulo Burnier, will launch a report on recent trends in competition law in Latin America. So I expect it will be interesting. Thank you, everyone. thank you very much, everyone, for being here, and I'll see you next month. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye now.
Gracias,
Thank you,
Margarida.
Margarida.
Gracias.